Professor Paul and Admiral Prakash, I think this is an issue which both of you can elaborate on a little bit. Professor Paul, you mentioned that in 2003, when this book was first published, that was a difficult time internationally in relative terms. I mean, the United States was still talking of India and Pakistan pretty much in the same breath. Or after 9/11, it stopped to happen, or it stopped gradually. I mean, until India was recognized as a country which was larger, more powerful, with better prospects than Pakistan. But at that time, there was also, as you mentioned, a great deal of talk about China and India. And these days, one of the noticeable differences is that we no longer feel comfortable talking about India and China in the same breath. You mentioned about China's growing reach in South Asia, in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan. With Pakistan, it has always had a very, very steady and stable relationship. Now, when we look into this decoupling of India and China in the last 15, 20 years, in some ways it's a good thing. It is because we are also being more realistic about our prospects, that we also do not have as much control as we thought we did at one point, that the economy will continue to grow by itself, sort of. The IT revolution basically favored us, and that was a bit of an accident. I mean, the way things happened, late 90s onwards. But the issue I would like you to talk about is, and Admiral Prakash has written on it a little bit, is that great powers, other than, saying that you aspire to great power status is one thing, but there are things that nations plan and do in order to be counted as great powers. China is a classic example of a country which literally planned to become a great power, aspired to be a great power status, and did those things that were necessary, whether we like it or not, or whether it's repression, whether it is authoritarian rule, and so on. But it took care of welfare, and it took care of foreign policy issues, its defense issues. It took care of its knowledge sector, its universities, innovation, and so on and so forth. Admiral Prakash, do you think that India has lagged behind in that area in particular? And while you would focus primarily on defense strategic issues, but I think it's a larger problem that, when I think of education all the time, because I do think that, and there are lots of other people who have been arguing the same things, that the future really is going to belong to countries, large or small, which can capture the knowledge sector, so to say. Because the weapons of the future are your computer and your cell phone, really, is it not? The way the ruling government functions, it has recognized that the future power, or you can mold people's thinking, their actions through technology. Now, we are using what's been produced elsewhere. We are using it as a tool, but we are not producing it ourselves, right? Now, what do you think exactly is lacking in our planning and thinking about the future? Or are we just stumbling on thinking that we'll just stumble on to become a great power? While you're free to obviously talk about more of the strategic sphere, Professor Paul, perhaps you can add in a little bit, and I'll add in my little bit too.
You're talking about technology. We've been defeated by the speaker, and I've been struggling with an iPhone for many weeks now, a new iPhone. Okay, I think Professor Paul, of course, is a distinguished academic who has a long history of studying India and its problems. But I think he's been a little condescending towards India in his talk. And I think that India was more or less predestined to be a major power, if not a great power. And that is why our post-independence leadership presumed that India will one day become a great power. And we have a lot of history to show for that, because if you look at Southeast Asia, the whole culturally, etc., it's all predominantly Indian culture. So we have been a great power, and there was no reason why we should not have resumed. We have territory, we have a population, etc., etc. And after independence, we added a few more factors which should have set us on the course to great power status, which is science and technology, nuclear weapons, large military, and the economy by itself the third largest economy in the world, the largest population in the world, youth, 45% of our population is young. So all these factors, I think, predestined us to become a great power. Now, why we haven't reached that status? Of course, China became a republic in 1949. We became independent in 47. I think both the countries were more or less at the same level technologically and economically, etc. Perhaps we were a little ahead of China at that point of time. Both China had this middle kingdom syndrome. They also believe they are destined to sort of rule the world or whatever. And India also had some kind of hubristic view of itself. So we started off by say 1950, started off more or less level. How did we diverge so much? I mean, the Chinese leadership obviously had a vision for themselves. The Mao Zedong, I think, had decided, when we were talking about Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, and Nehru thought he could lead Mao Zedong by the hand and bring him to the world stage. Mao Zedong had his own idea. He knew where China was going. They were definitely going to dominate Asia. And I think he had a gleam in his eye that China will be a nuclear power and a world power one day. And that vision was then translated into many actions. You spoke about weapons. Professor Paul spoke about weapons. Now, when there was a falling out between the Soviets and the Chinese in the mid-60s, Mao Zedong kept all Soviet weaponry from a rifle, from a AK-47 to a nuclear-powered submarine, and he gave a national vision that we will reproduce, we will reverse engineer everything. We also did something similar after 1962, but the vision was lacking. So, to sum it up, I think our political leadership has had too many distractions. Perhaps the democratic system that we've adopted is inherently chaotic and given to too many distractions, whereas the communist system is straightforward, and they've paid a heavy price for it. The Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward. They abolished, for example, one of the hurdles that we have today is religion, caste, and that kind of thing. The Chinese just abolished religion. So their path was made much easier. And then down the line, there are many factors. Once you are a totalitarian state, you can pursue agendas with single-mindedness, and in a democracy you have to pander to a whole lot of factors which do not allow you to have focus on. And we can come to other factors later on, but essentially I would say that the leadership, the national leadership in India has been distracted by too many things that have taken us away from the path of achieving great power status. We should have pursued economic, we missed the Industrial Revolution, so we jumped from an agrarian economy to a service economy. The industrial chunk is missing even till today. We can't make a decent machine. We have missed out on all that, and our political leadership hasn't focused on it. We are cheering today because we made a fighter. The whole country is cheering, but we should have done it. It's 30, 40 years old. We still don't make a turbo. We are sneering at the Chinese on social media that their fighter is a reverse-engineered Sukhoi 33, whereas ours is a home-built Tejas. But this is a minor consolation. I mean, so we really don't. So there's been a lack of focus. And in the recent past, of course, there's a huge distraction that we've now created for ourselves, instead of following an economic agenda, which would have then, the offshoot would have been military strength. Today our defense budget is limited to whatever it is, $60 billion US. And you can't ask for more because your economy is slowing down. It's not fair for the military to ask. If your economy was growing at 6, 7, 5%, 5.5%, we would. But we have allowed ourselves to be distracted from economic progression to social issues, religious, caste, etc. It's a huge distraction which is going to hurt us badly in the years to come. So I think, I'll just conclude by making two things. I think we have all the elements to achieve great power status. They're all there. Those components of comprehensive national power. There we have economy, national resources, population, demography, etc. What we lack is the will to greatness, governance, those kind of issues are missing. But perhaps it's not too late. If we still refocus ourselves and make a fresh start, perhaps we can get there. I will not talk about the strategic issues, which we can talk about later. I'll end.
Yeah, so I don't think we have a big disagreement on many of these things. I think where I would disagree is that the transmission is not that simple as we think. It's recognition by other is not automatic. This is what I would emphasize. It requires many structural conditions to change, domestic conditions to change. But in that context, India has come a long way. The recognition was there quite a bit in the past 2 decades or so. And I would also think that the missing of industrial revolution, everybody talks about it. Well, many of our parents didn't have many things that they missed, but we also tried to go to college, even when we had difficulties. So that is, the focus is absolutely right that, for instance, right now China, the big question is why Bangladesh is getting, and Vietnam are attracting quite a few industries that left China, when everybody thought India would be the best candidate. So that, I think, is something that the political and bureaucratic elite have to really think about. What did we didn't do like Bangladesh did, or some other area. So South Asia itself is showing places where there is possibilities exist, and even social developments. A lot of it is depending on how the elite and at the different levels. This is something that I keep saying, that it is not the national leadership alone that makes a country great. National leadership has to give the leadership at the state level, the panchayat level. There has to be recognition what my job is important to make this country great. And that hasn't happened as far as I see. It's not condescending, by the way. It's just that my innocent observation is that the village officer doesn't get it when he stops a file moving, or not giving that poor person coming and waiting for days to get a thing moving, or collecting corruption, little thing. It's not just India alone, other places too, but other places, by the way, small corruption is changing in many places. Even in Indonesia, I was told there is corruption, but it is, things get done at some point. That part is very important. I think the possibilities exist quite a bit because of the soft power itself is very important. It's the model that it has been. And I think we should be telling our elite leaders that don't shoot on your foot yourself. It may be tactically useful for electoral purposes, but in the long run, it will only hurt India to achieve this marker goal that they all want, by the way. And so that part, I think, it has to be discussed more. But the clear thinking here has to be what are the parameters that are missing? What can we learn from others? China, by the way, is not a great model. It's not replicable for most countries in the world. People forget that China is not replicable. By the way, I have 2-3 Chinese students in my graduate seminar. Suddenly I noticed they are not saying anything. They're afraid that their classmate may report. Is that something that you want to emulate? I don't think so. It's horrible when you think about it. Smart students, they cannot speak. They're very good in technology and other things. Their technological development is very high. So that model has or putting their Muslim population in prison camps, these are really bad models for 21st century. But they are going to get there with certain kind of push, and their wet strategy, the strategy of buying off, they're playing the colonial game up to a point, the BRI. They could be 60% of Asia's economy at some point. And all this show that we have to also to be competitive and think about our assets. How can we attract other countries, our neighbors? And that would require openness, tolerance to different opinions, and etc. So this kind of, all these components we talk about are interconnected. You mentioned economics and military. It's very true. Same with demographic. If you have a very good workforce, your economy will improve. India neglected human development. China change. That is one big part of China's achievement, human development from Mao's time onwards. All the East Asian states, as we know, except maybe Cambodia and all, put a lot of emphasis on education. 8% of the GDP was going into education. Myron Wiener has this superb book called The Child and State in India. We spent 2%, 1% higher education, 1% low. This was a political decision and it shouldn't have been there. This is where although great admiration for Nehru onwards, but somehow it got stuck in that education is not needed. That's not condescending, by the way. That's a choice you make, okay? Even here in our country, Kerala spent 36% on education. There are a lot of reasons for that. I come from there, I know the reasons quite a bit. But we have to think of how to improve that educational sector. The educated person produces better technology, as well as hygiene, as well as quality of life, and a lot of other things that come with education in the long run. So this is something, and I would like to hear, Pushkar, your views on why human development of that caliber is kind of neglected or getting some attention now, I think, but it is still not sufficient, no?
I'll get to that, but one of the interesting things about China is that before it became an economic power of the kind that we know it is from the 1980s onwards, and despite things like the human cost of achieving that, the Great Leap Forward and millions of people who died, but by approximately 1980, China had more or less addressed its welfare issues very, very well. So if you look at China in 1950 and India in 1950 and both countries in 1980, the biggest difference between the two of them was not in terms of economic growth. Economic growth under Mao and later, the difference, we grew at that 3.5%, and the Chinese didn't grow at a significantly higher rate. But the big difference in 1980, if we take just 1980 randomly as a cutoff, was that if you look at life expectancy in China, if you looked at literacy rates in China, if you looked at infant mortality, and if you looked at general welfare, the Chinese had really moved ahead of us. So that when in the 1980s they turned to economic reforms, liberalization, that takeoff was possible on the backs of a more educated, a healthier population. Now that is something which we have not yet resolved except in some states. So when we look at the knowledge sector, when we look at what needs to be done, the Chinese model, what we need to learn from China is not that you repress your population or you have an authoritarian regime, but that you take care of at least one thing first, or you have to simultaneously address economic growth and welfare. So what we seem to be doing in the last 20 years is trying to address both. But economic growth has, in the nature of economic growth is that in a free market economy or a relatively free market economy, or even in the Indian kind where you have a lot of political control of the economy, so to say, where should money be spent? So how much money goes into, say, Aadhaar or surveillance in general, as compared to how much money goes into primary education, right? So we are concerned about security, we are concerned about welfare, and say, well, this is the way to do it. But it's also about allocation of relatively scarce resources when your economy isn't growing. So how did the Chinese manage to allocate resources in a manner that they had healthier, more educated people by 1980, and how even today we are failing to allocate resources in a manner that our population is still, a large percentage of the Indian population is not educated. If you look at vaccination rates, something taken for granted in most countries around the world, especially poor, even poor countries. Our vaccination rates are about 80-90% in states like Kerala and Tamil Nadu. I mean, upwards of 90 in some cases. But even there we have lagged behind, and that's not an expensive process. So the point I'm getting to is that the Chinese can be a model in a different sort of way. Not in terms of being an authoritarian regime where the Communist Party controls everything, but also in terms of a regime which thought about these things, that addressing these things was important, and one could therefore grow on the back of that. So today we are talking of a demographic dividend, or nobody really talks about it anymore in a serious way. I mean, the latest reports are distressing. I mean, seriously distressing. But the larger idea behind that was that if you had an educated workforce, that could help you grow faster even under relatively adverse conditions. Now, we are looking at social unrest today. One of the reasons why that may be happening is not just because the students or younger people are unhappy with the regime, but think about it. What are their life chances? I mean, what are the employability rates of college graduates? No, you have stories, anecdotal stories about, you have, hundreds of jobs in the railways, lower level jobs, or in the police, or in some other services, and you have people with PhDs and MBAs and other kinds of degrees applying for these jobs. So either opportunities are low. Second, the quality of education part. Sure, you'll get to quality eventually. I mean, the Chinese got to quality education through, again, proper planning and a concerted push from the mid-90s onwards. Not in the 80s. I mean, just like us, they had a few, centers where a lot of money was being spent for defense purposes. And there's nothing wrong in spending on defense because it is ultimately linked to knowledge production of some kind. Now, you mentioned, knowledge production and how it has mattered in, instead of buying from France or the United States or elsewhere, why are we not producing our defense equipment? That's because our knowledge sector has lagged behind. We started off very well. Somewhere we have lost our way. The Chinese did not. The Chinese started to build great universities from the 1990s onwards, and these universities have left our IITs behind. Are the most prestigious research centers. Yeah, sure, there are good ones, ISRO and others, but again, we need more. People say, you're attacking the best universities in the country. Today, students from IITs are, turning out to protest. But the point is, what you need is more GNUs, more IITs, more everything, but you need that providers of knowledge, people who can create new knowledge. Without that, how can a country become a great power? Sure, by recognition, if the other great powers recognize it. But remember, in the 1990s and the 2000s, everybody always talked about the size of the Chinese market, right? So China escaped sanction by the United States, by European countries, because of the size of its market. Now, if we have stopped growing now, or if we are going to grow slower now, and that wealth is not going to be distributed, because ultimately it matters how many people buy toothpastes and soaps, not how many people buy Mercedes or expensive cars. It depends how many packets of biscuits are sold, or how many packs of butter are sold, how much milk is consumed, right? So I think that is the way to look at China. I think we have been looking at China the wrong way.
I want to make a small intervention quickly. You mentioned that it's not just leaders that matter. People on the ground also have to work to make the system successful. I think we faulted there. Successful countries choose the best people available to rule them. If you look at Singapore, for example, they pull out kids from school, the best, brightest kids, put them into the armed forces, in business, and eventually they end up as prime ministers. Even China does the same thing. They elect people at village level to the party, they go to the province, again they're elected, and eventually they land up in the central, whatever. We seem to elect the worst people in the country to rule us. I worked with a few defense ministers only. They are very fine politicians, good people, well educated. But not many of them knew much about national security. And that's true of, I can ask you, how many ministers of HRD know much about basic education and what have they done for it? So if we choose the wrong kind of people, I understand that 40% plus of members of parliament have criminal records. And what are their educational backgrounds? No one knows. So I would put it to Professor Paul, he's writing his next book, that one of the causes of our stumbling and not being successful is we have failed to choose the right people to run the country. The ministers, I would say about 85% ministers don't know what is their portfolio. They leave it to the bureaucracy to run the ministry, and that's why most programs have failed. The Prime Minister had expressed some noble sentiments and slogans and so on. Their implementation is virtually nil.
To what extent, I mean, and this is for both of you, and after which we'll go to the audience, to what extent does geography obstruct, India's rise as a bigger nation than than it is right now. In the sense that you have a hostile, I mean, we are engaging with China all the time, of course, but we do still consider China as enemy number 1 or 2, however you want to put it. And we have Pakistan on the other side. So it does drain us quite a bit in terms of addressing two very large borders. Whereas other countries, I mean, the United States benefited from its isolation. I mean, for all of the 19th century, 20th century, until it decided it was forced to intervene in the Second World War. So, on the other hand, Britain and France, they grow and they prosper while competing with each other, while fighting with each other. Now, and this has also got to do a little bit with, how countries become great powers, through wars or through peaceful means. How do other countries acknowledge? Why would China acknowledge India as a great power? I mean, it is in China's interest to have India as a lesser power. But do you think that geography has been unkind to us in that sense?
Honestly, geography is also what you make out of it. No, you transcend geography. And Indian leadership has. The look east and act east are the effort to transcend geography. In a world that is so interdependent, and you have this big coastline which allows the ships and shipping lanes to have some big say, geography is also a protector. Himalayas remained as a protector. No? Pakistan is a challenge because Pakistan has been playing geopolitical games with the great power system, and it has been playing for a long time. And every time there is a conflict in Afghanistan or even during the Cold War, it provided certain services to the great United States in particular. And that role, it was able to equalize India, but that's not a geography, that's a geopolitics. It's not geography alone. Of course, it has played the asymmetrical war in the Kashmir sector. I don't think any of that is that important. Indeed, you need competition to become a great power. However peaceful it is, you need economic competition, you need technological competition. You cannot get accepted just because you are what you are. You are get accepted when you contest. I'm not saying militarily, but in the past militarily. But today it is a soft power, is all arenas where, and that include the BRI and the response to that. When India came up with something, Africa corridor, I don't hear anything about it, or the Northeast corridor. All great initiatives. So you transcend geography through your grand strategy. And how important you are to the balance of power system. And that's where India also benefited. China is not going to be just easily going to get accepted as a global hegemon. All these East Asian countries are looking to India as a bridge builder, bridge power. You can only go up to a point, but the point is, if you are internally divided and a certain segment of the population is really suffering, then these countries are going to lose interest in you, okay? You're no longer a player of importance because your focus is on petty issues that they thought you resolved through your constitution and all that. So that's a big challenge. We need to think about whether all the initiatives the current regime and the previous regimes did, will it be hurt if we go back to the 1970s or the old models of nation building?
Thanks. Well, I agree with Professor Paul. You can't blame geography for our present situation. Imagine if Canada and Mexico were hostile to America, they wouldn't be in such a happy position. So I think the blame once again has to go to the national leadership. Had we anticipated China's moves into Tibet or done something about it at that time, perhaps we wouldn't be in this situation. Had we not disdained the use of force or understood better how to use military force, we wouldn't have lost the 62 war. And thereafter also we'd not handled Pakistan as we should have handled because of our weak strategic culture. The politician has been so engrossed in politics that he's paid no attention. We don't have a national strategy, national security strategy or a national doctrine. The armed forces are just making do with whatever jugaad they can think of. The present regime brought in a breath of fresh air by being, standing firm against Pakistan and striking them back. But once again, this surgical strike issue has been overtaken by politics. It has become a more political sort of used for more for political advantage than sending messages, strategic messages across to our friends. So I think geography is not to be blamed. Our weak strategic culture and our total preoccupation of our politicians with internal domestic politics has landed us in this situation, and that's we are making the same mistake again by pandering to internal party politics rather than looking at national grand strategy and national interests. It is happening right now, and if we don't step back, there's only bad news.